Welcome to Stream 3, New Demands of Leadership. My name is Melissa and I'll be moderating this stream. I'll invite our first speaker to present shortly, and then they'll be followed by our two other speakers before we then head into questions. So each speaker is going to have 15 minutes, and then the Q&A will be lasting 15 minutes as well. Please do, as we're going through, use the chat on the right-hand side of your screen to get involved throughout the presentations, and I'll raise any questions to speakers at the end. Without further ado, we can go through to actually perhaps Grace, and I'll just change the order slightly and start with you, if that's okay, whilst we wait for Burak to join us. So Grace Whelan from CRF.
Brilliant. So yes, thank you for joining us, and great to be part of this brilliant leadership stream here today. For those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, I am Grace. I'm a member of the research team here at CRF, and I've been leading on our hybrid working insights for the most part of this year. That's involved our permanent flexibility report, which we released in February, which hopefully many of you have seen and found useful, and that looked at some very early approaches to how companies were approaching sort of permanent hybrid working practices following what were the coronavirus restrictions of the past 18 months. Since then, obviously, things are moving very swiftly on this topic. Companies are having to change things at a very fast pace, but we've found that companies are choosing to head towards a hybrid future. You know, some are taking very strong stances either side, but mostly moving towards some kind of hybrid future, and are doing so through trust-based guidelines rather than strict policy, is what we're finding. And so therefore, we're finding that the future of work is looking very personalised in providing employees with a sense of choice, and that's really important in how companies are approaching hybrid. The coronavirus pandemic really showed what's possible and dispelled a few myths around productivity and efficiency when it comes to hybrid and remote working, and it's really lowered the waterline in terms of understanding employees' individual circumstances. So today, I'm going to look at kind of what that means for leading hybrid teams and how you can lead hybrid teams to thrive. What does this change mean for managers? How does that blurring of lines between work and home really affect how managers and firms interact with their employees? And how can managers make sure they're building inclusive and innovative cultures as part of that in sort of the next or new normal? So I'm going to outline, based on our research and ongoing conversations, some emerging areas for managers and organizations in leading hybrid teams. These are going to be based around the soft skills that we're seeing really coming across, which are going to be very important in doing this. And we would love you to share in the chat if you're finding similar themes, any questions you have about the themes, or any other areas that you're finding are emerging for helping your leaders to lead their new hybrid teams. So to kick things off, we start with communication. So research shows actually at the moment there's a bit of a disconnect between how leaders and employees see the future. So some recent McKinsey survey data found that sort of 3/4 of C-suite executives expect that their core employees are going to be back in the office 3 to 4 days a week at least. But contrast that with employees, about half of employees want to work those same amount of days at home. So there's a bit of a disconnect there, and many organizations are really racing to find this kind of finalized version of hybrid working for their needs. But the reality is that actually implementing hybrid working at scale, as I'm sure lots of you are finding in your organizations, it's going to take a bit of a longer term approach. It's got to challenge a lot of long-standing organizational norms, and it's going to really take that adoption of a test and learn approach in doing so. But the disparity between kind of leader and employee expectation poses a bit of a risk, an immediate risk really, in terms of employee discontent and dropping engagement if organizations don't really get that communication right at an organizational level. So rather trying to appear as you have all the answers, it's an immediate response to it. Employees and research finds could benefit from acknowledging that developing this hybrid operating model could take years. And in doing so, actually, it manages employee expectations and those risks that I spoke about, but it also really provides an opportunity to listen to employees and develop a very employee-led and inclusive operating model for the future. So an example of this is Brit Insurance, the international insurance company. So they're the CEO and the chief engagement officer sort of at the start of 2020, when first developing hybrid policies going forward, they randomly chose employees from across its international offices, across multiple divisions, levels, and generational cohorts, and had them really participate in the design process of new ways of working for the long term. And that was over a course of 6 months. They brought people together in different groups virtually, they engaged in learning modules together, and they also then attended this final half-day virtual hackathon where they finalised their ideas and pitched them directly to the CEO in developing that. So it's a good example really of how a transparent organisational level communication policy really helps companies to maintain engagement and develop that hybrid future that's best suited to their employees and their organisation. But from a team leadership point of view, communication is also going to be even more important to navigate that nuance and also new performance management processes that we're seeing come through. So with that really reduced in-person connection, people skills actually become much more important in being able to effectively manage teams. As I mentioned, our research is finding that organisations are placing much more increased onus on line managers as part of new performance management approaches, which favour much more kind of frequent one-on-one check-ins over the more formal planned performance reviews throughout the year. And our research highlighted the importance of this with the distinction between checking up and checking in during conversations such as these. So it's actually a distinction made by research scientist Christine Derry of MIT. And it just is the concept that instead of centering conversations purely around KPIs and performance outputs, actually hybrid leaders need to really be focusing on checking in empathetically to ascertain, the mindset and emotional status of those employees. It's a very time-consuming practice. It's a bit more time-consuming than sort of traditional performance reviews without those elements, but it's one that's going to promote a culture of trust within teams. And we've seen at one member organisation, they're prioritising those conversations by making it a requirement for employee wellbeing to be the first topic of discussion at quarterly check-ins to try and build that trust so that when a problem does arise, employees feel really comfortable and safe to be able to share, and also issues can be spotted early. Of course, in a hybrid setting, it's difficult and personal conversations happening over video call. It can be really hard to interpret that nuance in conversation. Leaders don't really have the luxury anymore of witnessing their team members in the office every day, observing their working patterns, engaging their motivations and concerns. So deep observational skills and conversational confidence are going to be really essential in hybrid leadership skills going forward. So I think Mel's going to drop in the chat, but I'm going to share some CRF resources as we go through. So for this section, we have a really brilliant resource on better conversations. It was a residential workshop with Wanda Wallace, and it gives some great tips and advice on having better communication within a workforce that can be applied to managing hybrid teams. So hopefully you find that useful. The second skill I want to pick up on is trust. So as managers and employees really traverse this uncertainty of hybrid work together, and this shift in trust and power that brings, an important skill to be able to build and is going to be building psychological safety and trust within that. So previously, kind of before this mass turn to hybrid working, work and home remained very separate entities, and managers didn't have to tackle so much the blending between the two when focusing on building psychological safety within teams. Obviously, that's a lot more blurred now, and creating an environment where employees feel really safe to speak up about their personal circumstances is going to be a crucial skill going forward. And to be able to lead teams into that next new normal, managers are going to need to be able to develop a level of trust and safety so that employees can be really open and comfortable about being honest about their situation. Some recent research from Harvard Business School Professor Amy Edmondson and also INSEAD Professor Mark Mortensen highlights that real responsibility of management now to expand that domain of in which work-life issues are safe to raise. And actually I'm going to pick up on that research because it suggests a series of 5 steps in building psychological trust to extend that domain into kind of more personal issues. So 5 steps. So first of all, it's about setting the scene. So showing you've got shared ownership of a problem, framing the need for building this kind of safety as a need for the group to problem solve and develop new ways of working effectively as we move forward. Then really important step 2, leading the way. So the best way to do that is expose your own vulnerability as a leader, share your own hybrid working personal challenges and constraints where possible, and recognizing that managers have to go first and expose themselves in taking those risks before employees may want to follow. Step 3, take baby steps. So, it's going to take time to build that trust. Don't try and jump in at the deep end by demanding or even sharing sort of very big disclosures, but start with small disclosures that are more manageable, and then we'll build that trust over time. Step 4 is kind of about feedback, so sharing positive examples, although you're not going to share, obviously, what people are telling you in these conversations, but you can share how you think that's building a better culture within a team. Your belief that this increased transparency is helping teams to design new ways of working effectively. And finally, being a really vigilant watchdog, really, to make sure you're monitoring the process, or leaders are monitoring the process, opening up about intentions, and also being careful to be able to censor where appropriately and take quite a hard line where people are treating the process inappropriately or taking advantage of the share of personal information without that. Obviously, this is a bit of a bridge of a gap. We know psychological safety is very important to effective teams. There's a Google study from a couple of years ago that outlined it as one of the top priorities in an effective team, but it's now about making sure it opens up into that new domain of personal as well as just kind of the work scenario. Again, some great CRF resources in the chat. So firstly is our paper on the concepts and skills of a trusted advisor. So a slightly different context, but again, can be really useful in applying to managing teams and how to build trust within teams and between colleagues. And then we also have our in-depth research report on trust as well, which looks at how organizations can manage trust conundrums and dilemmas in the real world, which has some great insight in there as well. And then finally, to move on to inclusion. So, in a hybrid working environment, it really risks exacerbating those feelings of exclusion, creating in and out groups, dynamics within teams. And we've seen companies, as I say, taking largely personalized approaches to flexibility. But then that also creates potential feelings of inequity between employees, being offered different choices between managers and afforded different levels of flexibility due to what they actually can do in their roles and their teams. We know the well-established benefits of having inclusive working environments on candidate attraction, retention, performance and decision-making. So that's going to be even more important moving forward. But hybrid working environments do make it easier to avoid those difficult conversations and minimize those opportunities for spontaneous new connections. So that can have a bit of a negative impact on employees' sense of belonging, but also can really mean missed opportunities for development. So going forward, senior leaders and team managers are really going to need to set that tone and the expectations around hybrid inclusion and try as much as possible to embed that into daily working practices. And we're finding that's a bit of a pinch point for companies at the moment, how they're managing to get managers to build that really into their daily working practices so that it's becoming part of the culture and being mindful about it. So we have a great piece of research on remote inclusion that offers some recommendations for building remote inclusion in remote and hybrid settings. So I'm just going to run through a few of the tips of those just to kind of finish off. So first of all, looking for opportunities to upskill your senior leaders, so making sure they've got the support, they're represented on D&I councils, they've got really robust lines of communication with employee networks, and making sure that they're linked up to sort of high potential talent across that demographic spectrum in a hybrid world. As part of that, incentivizing line managers as well to incorporate this inclusion work into their daily practices so that you're making sure that they're doing that, allowing the time. It's a very time heavy process, so allowing managers the time to carve out for inclusion work and setting performance objectives related to that where possible. We identify in that report some at-risk groups, but they're going to be different for every organization. So identifying the at-risk groups for exclusion within your company, and each group is going to need developed targeted responses. So what are you going to do to be able to target that group specifically? And then finally, supporting line managers in team processes is similar to senior leaders, but making sure they've got the resources available to them. And companies seem to have been doing a great job of this through the kind of intermediate of hybrid working, but for the longer term, making sure they're supported in those team processes. Again, we'll share that full report on remote inclusion, and we also have a much shorter article on setting yourself up for hybrid meetings. I know they're sort of a bit of a pinch point for organizations about whether they're good or not, but we have a resource on that. And it'll be great to hear how also you're approaching inclusion in your organization in response to hybrid working. So that's kind of a bit of a lightning speed through some soft skills for leading hybrid teams to thrive. Obviously, it shows that there's a lot of overlap, and it's going to really require excellent people skills, I think, from managers and team leaders. And you're going to need a bit of leadership development to match this as well. I just want to flag at this point that we are planning CRF to do a sort of a more in-depth research piece at the tail end of this year into strategic leadership and leadership development. And if anyone in here would be interested in being involved in that, it'd be great to hear from you, and I can share my my email in the chat, and to chat about sort of case studies and your thoughts on that. So that'd be brilliant. But thank you for your time today. I know we've got questions at the end, and I'm happy to answer any then. So thank you, and I will hand back over to Mel.
Thank you, Grace. Yes, and I know just how many conversations you have had with all of our different members and different organisations, both globally and in the UK and Europe, to really hone in on that research and get that data set to make some of those recommendations that you'll find in the paper. Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Burak, I'm hoping that you're all sorted now and can hear us. Excellent. Yeah. So I will now hand over to Burak Koyuncu to talk about leadership from LHH.
Hello, everyone. Looking forward to talking to you about transformational leadership today. I think the first session in the morning with Michael was a really good trigger to think about transformation and how organizations are leading it. For those of you who don't know LHH and myself, I am a managing director at LHH. LHH is a global leadership development and transition company. We are part of the Adecco group. Today, I'll talk about some of our insights on transformational leadership that comes from both my own research and experience, and also a research that LHH conducted about 3 years ago when we were revising our transformational leadership offering. And when it comes to transformation, I think when it comes to transformational leadership, there are two angles to look at. One is around leading, the behaviors, actions leaders take to lead transformations, and the other part is around being, how leaders are when faced with transformational challenges and what their mindsets are like. So I'll try to cover both topics in the short time we have. Let's start with the leading part of it, leading transformations. I will start with some quick insights to warm us up to the topic, and that will also show us a little bit of the complexity about this topic. I will ask you some questions if you like to answer on the chat. I might not see them, but it would be good to have some of your answers there. The first question is, one change at a time or all at once? Which one is better? I can hear some of you saying that one change at a time, or the others thinking all at once. I'll go through these quickly. Actually, there might be another answer, it depends. And maybe all answers are correct, and it depends on the context. But one thing that has become clear in recent years is that it is not possible to be a successful organization anymore by doing one change at a time. You might remember John Cutter's influential work from 1990s when he wrote about the 8-step model for leading change. And back then, John Cutter himself argued that one change at a time was the best way to lead change in organizations. But he himself in 2014, in his new book, said actually it's not possible to succeed anymore by going with one change at a time. And Warren Perry, a former colleague of mine, he analyzed over 1 million change journeys, and his research also showed that highest performing organizations have a lot more change at a faster pace simultaneously happening than lower performing firms. So this is one angle that actually tells us something around how leadership needs to also change. Another question, top down or bottom up, which one is important, which one is better for effective change or transformation? Any thoughts? I'll give you a few seconds to type your answers in the chat. I can also hear you thinking about top down or bottom up, or maybe it depends on the context. Again, all the answers are correct, but I want to share another answer here based on some of my research as well as Warren Perry's and Cutter's. The answer is inside out. basically change leadership radiates from the center of the organization, from the middle manager levels up and down. This is again based on Warren Perry. If you haven't seen his book, Big Change, Best Path, it's a really interesting book about leading change. And based on a similar data set with Warren, Diana Barea and a few colleagues, we worked on analyzing some of the successful change journeys as well. And what we found was very similar, that all change journeys, when they are really successful, include people at all levels. And John Cutter's research, also more recent research in compared to 96 research, actually showed that it's not anymore enough to have a guiding coalition of people. It's not anymore enough to have just some sponsors leading change. It is important to bring an army of volunteers across the organization to lead change. Anyhow, let's go to the next one. Which one is first, understand or commit? Obviously, if you think of the popular change management tool that consultancies use for ages, the stakeholder commitment curve, it goes as understand, agree, adopt, and commit, right? What recent research showed is that actually that order is only correct for lower performing organizations. Higher performing organizations have a total different situation where trust in leadership is so high that people don't need to even understand to commit to something. They just jump on the bus, they get on the bus without even knowing where it's heading. So it is a very interesting insight. Again, it shows the importance of leadership in leading transformations and change efforts. And it also explains why we might be having not much success in leading transformation and change, right? Since Cutter's initial writings, or maybe even more, a few decades ago, for the last 30 years or so, we know only 25% of transformation efforts succeed. And you wonder why, after 30 years and 30,000 more models of change, we still haven't improved that statistic. And one hypothesis I have about it is that maybe because what we know about change is also changing, which we need to be aware of. And LHH research actually brought another interesting insight around this, which is around actually the focus of organizations. Organizations actually prioritize change over transformations. So maybe we need to understand change and transformation as two distinct concepts. And what change efforts focus on are things like restructuring, re-engineering, reorganizing, but these get priority over reinventing, re-engaging, reimagining, similar to the topics Michael mentioned earlier. So organizations really focus on change more than transformation, and there are potentially many reasons for this. One reason I will come to in a minute again is from positive psychology research that would claim that actually human brains are focused more on the negative, fixing the negative, rather than focusing on the positive. And this might be one of the challenges. What this makes us think about leading change and transformation. First, let's look into change and transformation as two different things. Yes, they are related concepts, but actually change is more focused on improving what you do, fixing some of the negative issues that need to be improved, almost looking at the past, fixing the past. And transformation is creating something new, really something dramatically different. And it's really about imagining that future, that positive future. And that does require different capabilities from leaders. So based on our research on this, there are some capabilities that we call foundational leader capabilities, knowing the business, applying owner's mindset, setting strategy, etc., are those capabilities that leaders need to lead change efforts successfully. I think there was Pratik had a question, very nice question around managing efficiency and innovation. So if we look at it that way, managing efficiency requires these foundational leader capabilities. But to lead transformations, we believe leaders need more than those foundational capabilities. They need to navigate ambiguity, imagine the future, inspire their people, etc. So we have identified these capabilities for leaders and middle manager level as well. And one thing I have experienced during during the pandemic period, advising leaders and coaching more than 100 people in the last year or so, I have realized most leaders are really good at the foundational bit. They are good at getting things done, planning for things and applying them, but they struggle with navigating ambiguity. They struggle with inspiring their people or imagining the future when there's so much uncertainty, which again highlights the importance of transformational leadership in this age. I don't know how much time I have, but I'm trying to go to one final point. Transformational leadership. I will use again positive psychology analogy here. Kim Cameron, a positive organizational scholar, he came up with this continuum of positive deviance, and the argument in the positive psychology research for a long time has been that actually organizations and individuals are missing a point by focusing too much on moving to normal, moving from negative deviance to normal or positive deviance to normal. People don't like deviance, basically. They don't want to be in the negative deviance. They don't want to be in positive deviance. When people are in positive deviance, some structures, processes try to pull them back to normal. But what I would like to argue is most organizations, when they focus on change, they focus on moving from negative deviance to normal, which is moving from illness to health, moving from unprofitable to profitable. But organizations don't think about moving from health to Olympic fitness or moving from profitable to generous. And my belief is that transformation starts when you start moving from that normal to the positive deviance. And transformational leadership requires that mindset that athletes have to really work on their muscles even though they don't see the effect that same day, do something even though they don't necessarily know certainly whether something will work or not, so that being in a positive mindset and going for extraordinary rather than normal is what will help organizations become more transformational. Brilliant. With that, I will stop sharing.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Burak. And yeah, there's some great conversation in the chat about some of the great content that you've shared. It's great to see a list of those key capabilities, especially as we understand from Grace's presentation how much more responsibility and importance there is on the role of the leader and the manager. So brilliant to see. Thank you. And I'll now hand over to Tom Gaunt from BTS to finish off the speaker set.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the insights so far, Grace and Burak. Looking forward to building on some of those comments as well. So good morning, everybody. My name is Tom Gaunt, and I've spent the last 7 years at BTS working with organizations through a range of change and disruptions, working with technology companies shifting into the cloud, manufacturing companies wrestling with the fourth industrial revolution, consumer goods companies expanding into new categories and channels. And of course, all of this was even before COVID-19 turned everything upside down. What I'm really excited about is the opportunity to talk to you about something that's always fascinated me about change, which is how is it that we can consciously shift our mindset in order to better prepare ourselves for disruption? So I'll be sharing some of our experience and research on this point. But before we get there, I think it would be a bit remiss of me not to tap into some of your own experiences of disruption, because the last year and a half have posed challenges for all of us. And so one thing that I'm really curious to hear is, if you were able to travel back in time, so if you could travel back in time a year and a half to before the pandemic, what one piece of advice would you give yourself to better prepare for the forthcoming disruption? So please take a moment just to reflect on that question. Imagine yourself a year and a half ago and think about what kind of advice you would provide to that former version of yourself. Invest in Bitcoin. Yes, thank you for that, James. I don't want to talk about my history with cryptocurrencies. It's quite sad. Any other? So Rachel, thinking much longer term, and that's an interesting point. I think we heard from Mike earlier. How do you manage this kind of dichotomy of, in the pandemic, having to focus on the immediate short term, but then also keep that long-term perspective in mind there as well? Sandra, absolute clarity on deliverables across the organization. So trying to get some clarity from that ambiguity. Grace, the long-term approach as well. Bridget, take time out to think. Yeah, it's been an opportunity sometimes for us to really take a step back and reflect on what's important, but in the maelstrom of disruption, it's not always possible to do that. Louise, try to focus on the few big things. So how can we retain that bigger picture and purpose in the face of all of these changes? Nikki, one size doesn't fit all. We need to adapt to different contexts. And Bernadette says, there are good days and bad days. I think we need to be kind to ourselves, right? In the face of this disruption, it was sometimes hard to recognize that as well. So I've got a couple more. Andy saying, trust in human behavior and culture will enable you to find ways through the tactical challenges. So yeah, human behavior and culture, 2 topics we'll dial in on in a minute. And I've got a few more comments here around resilience, humanity, and creating time for ourselves as well. So thank you all very much for sharing some of these brilliant pieces of advice that I wish I had a year and a half ago. We'll build on some of these insights as we continue our conversation. And please, if at any point you've got another observation or reflection, type that into the chat and we'll try and have a bit of interaction throughout the next 12 minutes or so. Before we get to mindsets, however, it is worth pointing out or reflecting on the fact that change itself has changed. And there are several reasons for this. One of the key reasons is the underlying pace of technological change. This means that we're operating today in systems of ever greater complexity, challenge, and potential. And then on top of this, we've got COVID-19, which has brought about huge challenges in terms of the way that we work. It's changed customers' expectations of us. It's changed the demands that we place on leaders. This isn't to say that change was easy in the past, but I would suggest that in the past, change followed a longer arc. Indeed, if we were to use a metaphor here, we might want to say that change in the past was a little bit like surfing. Why like surfing? Because in surfing, what do? You sort of paddle out into the ocean, you watch the waves coming in, and then you wait for that ideal wave, that wave that you want to jump on, to surf into the shore. And then you've got a choice. You can paddle back out to get the next wave, or you can just chill out on the beach, have a drink, talk to your friends about that great surfing experience. Indeed, in the past, change followed more of the classic S-curve, starting with that period of experimentation and slower growth, then accelerating to a point of maturity and eventual decline, at which point you could jump onto the next S-curve. Today, things are radically different. Time has sped up, and as Burak pointed out, we need to often manage many changes at once. Indeed, we're facing multiple simultaneous change curves, combining human and technological. You might want to think today about a life sciences company, on the one hand dealing with the fact that their top blockbuster product is just about to fall off the patent cliff, also trying to understand how to harness data and technology to deliver better patient outcomes, and then trying to think about what sort of culture and ways of working to inculcate in a post-COVID world. This presents new challenges to leaders, and so we need to search for a new metaphor. I would suggest that change today is a little bit more like white water rafting. Why is this? It's a team sport. You never quite know what is coming next. It requires constant adaptation, constant communication, constant refinement. Also needs new equipment, right? We need helmets, we need a goggle, we need goggles, we need a life vest. So what do we know about change today? It's continuous, it's a thrilling ride, but it requires new skills and a new sense of perspective. What's therefore crucial is for us to ask ourselves to what extent we're prepared for this forthcoming disruption. We need to ask ourselves some questions. Why do our responses to change differ, and what is going on under the surface? As we ask these questions, we arrive quickly at the topic of mindset. What we know is that how a leader thinks about change is one of the crucial determinants of how successful any change effort will be. And herein lies the rub. Many of us have a mindset towards change that was formed earlier in our careers. We might believe that change is linear. We might have that surfing mindset towards change, and it served us well in the past, but is not necessarily going to serve as well in the future. And this is a question that really fascinates us at BTS. So what we've looked to do is to combine the research with our own experience of working with thousands of leaders through complex disruption. And that has allowed us to decode 4 common mindsets that speak to different relationships to change. Each of these relationships contains its own challenges and opportunities, and I wanted to share these with you. As I talk through these relationships, you might also want to reflect a little bit on your own mindset towards change, perhaps retrospectively, some of the things we've talked about in terms of COVID already, or maybe forward-looking, thinking about your perspective on our shift now to the hybrid way of working that Grace talked about. So the 4 relationships that we've identified, the first is the change receiver. The change receiver operates from a mindset that our leaders will get us through this. And you might be reading this and thinking, this sounds like quite a junior person in an organization. But on the contrary, we've observed change receivers at all levels of the organizations that we've worked with. Indeed, recently working with a global technology company, we noticed that even those executives who reported into the C-suite talked about decisions being made by HQ. They talked about how looking up for direction was a behavioral norm within the organization. And this presents 2 challenges. Change receivers have 2 core challenges. The first is that often they are paralyzed waiting for direction or decisions from above. The second is that when those decisions are made, when that direction comes, often change receivers will act on that without providing any type of feedback. They won't raise legitimate concerns. They won't talk about how it's possible that this may not be the right course of action. This differs a little bit from the second relationship that we decoded, the change resistors. The change resistors live in the past. They operate under the hope or the belief that this too shall pass. And this is a tendency that we observed in a global manufacturing organization. In this company, very senior leaders were typically rotated as part of their development. What these leaders often encountered, however, when working with their new local teams was a degree of skepticism, of inaction, of resistance. And the reason for this is because the local teams were used to these rotations. They knew that if they paid passive heed to this new sense of direction, but ultimately continued to do what they were doing, then eventually that leader and the sense of direction would change. So we see resistors doing one of 2 things, either overtly resisting change, typically relying on precedent, on historical reasons to not do something, or, as in this example, paying lip service to a change, but then when it comes to execution, finding a whole host of reasons not to deliver on that change. A third relationship that we decoded was the change controller. The change controller will plan, direct, act, they'll do anything in the face of ambiguity. If you've ever worked with somebody who, under conditions of stress, tends to become a micromanager, chances are that that person will be a change controller. We worked with one organization that recognized that this was a bit of a cultural quirk that they had. This tendency was very common, and it created some real challenges in terms of their quarterly business reviews. People tended to take a very backwards looking approach to those discussions. They were super detail orientated, and that acted as a real barrier to growth and learning. So they undertook a complete revision of that process. What these 3 mindsets have in common is the view that change is temporary. And often this is based in fear. The challenge, however, is that if you believe that change is temporary in an environment of constant change, this actually creates more stress and anxiety, because when that change never ends, that is not a good situation to be in. So we've also decoded an alternative path here, a fourth relationship to change that we call the change-ready leader. Change-ready leaders accept that change is a relentless fact of life, and they exhibit three core characteristics. The first is that they have an opportunity mindset. They see opportunities where others might see challenges. They formulate a plan B and even a plan C, understanding that plan A isn't going to work out perfectly every time. Secondly, they focus on creating emotional agreement around change. They focus on creating emotional agreement around the change and the reason for that change, rather than just focusing on cognitively explaining the why behind the particular direction. And thirdly, they co-create and co-offer change with teams, holding those teams to account, but also encouraging them to step into ambiguity and complexity. And now you might be looking at the slide here and thinking this all sounds good. We see this alternative relationship to change, but what can we actually do about this? And this is the key point. We know that we can't always control our immediate reaction to something, but we can consciously shift our mindset. We just have to be thorough about how we go around doing that. And we've identified 4 steps that help us to translate a mindset shift into behavioral change. So first of all, we need a disruption. We need a trigger that helps us to understand what are the mindsets that served us well in the past, which are not fit for the future. And then we need to consciously go about that shift. So for example, how can I shift my mindset around ambiguity from one of fear and trepidation to one of excitement and opportunity, so I can inject more energy into change efforts? Thirdly, I need to live these mindsets. What are the tools that I can adopt? What are the habits that I can focus on changing in order to translate a new mindset into daily actions? And then fourth, this needs to be reinforced through reflection, through feedback. And I also need to have an opportunity to think about what future mindset shifts are going to be required in order to remain agile. Of course, none of this occurs in a vacuum. It occurs in the context of complex organizations, a complex cultural context as well. And here, what's really worth remembering is the fact that our response to change is always contagious, and therefore it's important that we choose it wisely. So thank you very much for listening to me. I'm really passionate about this topic, so I'd love the opportunity to discuss it further with anybody who is interested by anything that was shared there. And with that, Melissa, I will hand back to you.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Tom. That was great. And I really love the idea of change as the whitewater rafting. I was sort of thinking back to Burak's presentation as well, and thinking maybe change is about keeping the raft actually afloat, and transformation is then, choosing the path and planning for the path and transforming to avoid the rocks and the sharp turns and that sort of thing. Thank you to everybody who has presented. It's all been really inspirational presentations, and we do have some questions in the chat for you guys now. If anybody else has questions, please do feed them through into the chat, and we'll look to get to them. So I'm going to start with a question that came through for Grace, thinking about, based on your research, and obviously you talked about how many organizations are moving away from the sort of strict policies and rules to an approach that has much more trust-based. What do you think are the risks of that? What are you seeing?
Yes, I think it's a really interesting question. And I guess preface all of this by saying that, everyone's approach has to be rooted in that company's strategy and that company's purpose. And that's really where it should come down from. A lot of the companies I spoke to, I would say all of the companies I spoke to, their approaches are rooted in surveys and data from their employees directly. They are calling for that kind of flexibility, and so they're meeting an employee need in doing that. So from an employee side of view, they're doing that. I think very strict approaches, obviously we're seeing some of the big banks take very strict approaches with concerns around learning and development and culture and their young employees coming through is kind of what they're citing. I think the risk is that you miss being able to incorporate learnings and efficiencies that you've taken on board during the hybrid process. Part of evolving your hybrid strategies now going forward is to reassess some of the processes that you had before, and actually not just bolting on hybrid things to how you're working before, but incorporating that and seeing actually where your company can be more efficient, and are there transformation parts in that as you go forward. So I think from an organizational point of view, a strict approach has that risk. I think a pro for taking a very flexible approach is that it manages to bring forward lots of those brilliant things we've seen in terms of, there are risks in terms of inclusion, but actually getting a hybrid scenario right going forward can be very inclusive and can be much more diverse in the types of people and the types of demographics it can bring into the workforce, how it lets people work, and the benefits of that in terms of well-being and stress as well. I think flexible approaches will be good. I've talked about it being a long-term approach. Flexible approaches will be good to be able to take that test and learn approach going forward. If you take a strict approach from this point now, well, are you missing out on a lot of learnings as we then move into the next stage of what this sort of pandemic and working experiment becomes? And finally, in our research, it does, have come across studies that shows that greater autonomy over how you work does result in higher productivity. So giving people that autonomy, it helps balance stress. And also in terms of employee attraction and retention, it is what employees are looking for now, sort of a higher level of flexibility on a much more personal level. So, it's what's right for your company, but I'd see those as some of kind of the main pros and cons, really.
Brilliant. Thank you, Grace. Actually, Burak, it would be interesting to hear your views on this question as well, around some of the risks for different approaches that companies are taking.
Yeah, I fully agree with Grace's points. I think that trust is probably the key element. I was always a believer in trust in employees. There are different models around how organization structure work, right? And I think this was from Corporate Rebels a few years ago, before the pandemic started. The shortest employee handbook has 3 words in it: "We trust you." Basically, I think that approach does really help employees grow and really feel they are supported. But the challenge is organizations don't let control go easily. And sometimes there are some logical reasons for it, sometimes not. I see the challenge about trust here is that sometimes really trust, if you don't do it well, can also create side effects, like negative side effects, right? For example, if you let everybody just do whatever, whenever they want, do you have the right culture to support that? If the right culture is not there, maybe it won't really work. And I think it's a little bit about that balance between where you are and what you want to be. And if you can find that trust together with right vision, right culture, right opportunities to interact, then everything is possible. But yeah, the challenge becomes when you try to control. Employees don't want to be controlled. There's going to be tension. If you don't control, there might be other tensions, because maybe you're not actually inspiring people in the right way, and people don't want to work for you. So there might be so many different angles to look at it.
Yeah, no, you're right. Absolutely, it is all about that empowerment. Empowering your employee. We actually had a great quote at our conference towards the end of last year about employees will view your approach to flexibility through the prism of their own personal circumstances. So that there is no one size fits all. It's all about empowerment.
Yeah.
Another question now. Grace.
I was just going to say, I think to some point also now, like, the cat's kind of out of the bag. We've all, the experiments were happening in this before, but employees have had 18 months to see how it works and what works for them. So they have some kind of bargaining power within that as well, that I think companies have to recognise.
Absolutely, it's expected now. Yeah. Another question for you, Burak, about where do you see the opportunities for organisation and design and development practitioners to be catalysts for transformational thinking and change?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Andy, for that. I was thinking about it. I think the obvious answer I have for that is around reframing the story. Most organizational leaders have this mindset that I mentioned. They become leaders in organizations because they are good at getting things done. They are doers. They are good at change. But that can become a liability when you want to transform. And the way to move there, the way all deep practitioners can help that is when they reframe the story. So I'll give an example that I have actually had to work a lot of people on during the pandemic. At the peak times of the pandemic, what happened in some organizations that had some hits in their top line, but they were still profitable, is that they went into this anxiety around, what do I do? My revenues decrease. I'm profitable still. I can go on like this, but I have high cost in comparison to my revenue and what I used to have. So what do I do? Do I make people redundant, or do I do something else? The mindset there is, do I need to fix something? I'm anxious. My costs seem a bit higher than normal. Do I need to fix something? I had to work a lot with some leaders, like especially in those industries where there's hope after the pandemic. I was like, let's look at it from a different perspective. Let's think about the opportunities you might have if you don't make your team members redundant right now. What if after the pandemic, the demand for your services increase? What are you going to do with that? Most of your competitors might be losing their people, and if you are keeping them, you will be leading the market. What about thinking about that? So it's reframing that anxiety to something more positive. It's just a simple, basic example, but I think all the practitioners have a huge role in that. There is a lot of fear-based management models going on around. So what we need to do is we need to bring that hope-based, future-focused opportunities, as Tom mentioned. That is something we need to focus on. Obviously, there will be resistance to that too. I know OD teams don't have P&L responsibility. Some leaders might say, yeah, you're saying all the positive, good stuff, but you don't have P&L responsibility. And there comes the creativity. If there's a way to bring it to P&L impact, reframe the story, yes, it might not have short-term P&L impact, but long-term impact, giving people hope about that, I think is the best way to start helping them imagine the transformational future.
Brilliant, thank you. And thank you for sharing that example about reframing. And Tom, would love to get your thoughts on some of those tips about, and another question from Bernadette as well, on changing that mindset from fear-based to opportunity. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that was a great question. I think the point that Burak mentioned around reframing is so critical here. And I suppose that there are two levels that you can maybe take the question. The first is what works well from from a leadership perspective. And I think what I've observed working, in particular with one organization that was going through a really bold, ambitious transformation, is it's so powerful for leaders to acknowledge that and acknowledge the excitement of the journey and acknowledge through a sense of vulnerability that things aren't always going to work out. That there are going to be some avenues that we pursue that we need to step back from as well, and setting that climate, I think, is such an important opportunity there as well, which is easy to say, but incredibly hard to do in an organization that's maybe been doing the same thing for decades and is now really looking to pivot. So those kind of symbolic moments and setting those expectations, I think, are of critical importance. I was also thinking about Bernadette's question on more of a personal level as well, because there's how do we as individuals, navigate the change, the disruption, the uncertainty that we face. And I think there were some great pieces of advice to our former selves earlier, about thinking about, taking a step back, reflecting, focusing on the big things as well. I think a lot of it is the story that we tell ourselves, and that there's maybe an opportunity here to think about redefining success. At least I grew up with this idea that success was about knowing everything and being able to control everything and being on top of everything. And I've really struggled with this sense of how can I redefine success as, exploring things, as learning things, as experimenting, as accepting that things aren't always going to go well. And then to get a little bit more tangible and perhaps tactical, I think that there's also the key elements of intentionality here. And there's a whole host of things that I think can work well here. Something that that I know a lot of people have found really helpful is even, something like journaling. Waking up in the morning and thinking, what is it that you're grateful for? Naming your fears, and then talking through, thinking through those fears about how they can be translated into opportunities as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Tom. It is important to think about that personal level, and we've all been through it, and having to reframe some of our own thoughts. Another question for you, actually, around given the shift that we've talked about today, and we all know, to hybrid working, how important do you think physical presence of leaders during transformation is, particularly in leading that resistor role, the resistors?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a really interesting question, because there's almost, if you think about an organization that's already going through a transformation, or is just about to embark upon a transformation that they're driving themselves, you have that, and then you have this transformation caused by hybrid as well. So it's layering, transformation on top of transformation. I think a lot of the things that Grace and Burak said hold true in this situation as well. It's about experimenting, co-creating. It's also, I think, about retaining a degree of agility here. Understanding that, particularly in the face of resistance, that perhaps having a concrete plan at the beginning that you stick to rigidly is not the way to manage this, but you need to meet people where they are. I think one thing that I've picked up so far in the world of hybrid working is the intentionality, again, of these kind of symbolic moments. So what are the moments we're actually coming together physically to have a conversation, which is not always easy to have virtually, is really going to pay dividends in terms of getting people on board with the transformation effort, and also having the conversations that you don't always have in the slightly more formal virtual setting, right? That are so important in terms of really getting your finger on the pulse of where people are with respect to transformation as well.
Okay, well, thank you again. Thank you to everybody who joined today's stream, who asked questions and contributed. And of course, thank you to our three speakers who have led the discussion.